Hi class, so this week we're covering chapter 5, measurement. So measurement is the process of quantifying a set of observations of a phenomenon. Measurement involves developing a set of procedures that can be systematically performed reliably. It may involve having individuals respond to a series of questions to determine their well-being, or having someone rate the cooperativeness of a work colleague. So, measurement is the process of defining the concepts that researchers are interested in measuring. Measurement involves demonstrating that the measures that you're using to assess the concepts are reliable and valid. Abstract concepts like diversity, multiculturalism, cultural competence can mean different things for different people, making it hard to study their effects. A conceptual definition is the working definition that a researcher uses for a concept. It helps researchers hone in on what they will research and allows the researcher to understand what phenomenon was studied. Operationalization is the process of defining the exact way that the researcher plans to measure the concept. This is the operational definition of the concept. So, when it comes to questionnaires and surveys, the researcher can ask the respondents to fill out a questionnaire or a survey, and based on these answers, the operationalized concept can be measured. For example, for the concept of mental health services utilization, you may want to operationalize this variable as utilizing the services of a mental health professional to address any of the following: alcohol use, anxiety, stress, or emotional problems. To measure the effects of stigma on mental health services utilization, you would ask persons to fill out a survey or questionnaire. So for researchers, the concept that was operationalized is referred to as a variable. And a variable is any factor, trait, quality, or condition that varies and can be measured. The diagram illustrates the operationalization of mental health service utilization. So the concept we want to operationalize is mental health utilization, which you can see is enclosed in a circle. The items on the survey are displayed in the squares. So the survey question, for example, would be, have you ever seen a mental health professional in the last year for any of the following: alcohol use, anxiety, stress, or emotional problems? Please place a check mark in the box next to your response. Respondents' answers to the questions will help you then determine if they have used mental health services in the past year. So measurement involves assigning the variables a numeric value or meaning. There are 4 levels of measurement. Nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Knowing the level of measurement is very important for determining the type of statistical procedures the researcher will use to analyze their data. So before you can determine what statistical test to use, you really need to know what your level of measurement is. So it's really important as you're designing your survey that you think about those questions and the level of measurement you're using, because later on that will have an effect on what statistical tests you can use. The level of measurement depends on how the researcher operationalizes the variables of interest. Variables measured at the nominal level are defined by their attributes or characteristics. These attributes are of 2 categories: exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So attributes in the exhaustive category describe every characteristics associated with a phenomenon being studied. Attributes in the mutually exclusive category, a person can select only one because it is the only characteristic that accurately describes the phenomenon associated with the person. The variable needs to be assigned a numeric value through the process of coding. So these numeric values do not suggest that the responses are qualitatively or quantitatively different from each other. The numeric value is only used so that the researcher can perform the appropriate statistical procedure. So with the nominal level of measurement, you have to code and provide numerical value. On your survey, you use a numerical value. For example, you ask, what is your race or ethnicity? And the categories can be Black, Hispanic, Caucasian, Asian, another. Okay, so those, as you can see, you can't run a statistical test with words. So in order to give those words meaning and being able to run it in the statistical test, you would have to code it and assign them a number. So you would give 1 for Black, 2 for Hispanic, 3 for Asian, 4 for other. So when you run your statistical test, you will be running the numbers, but once you get a number back, you will know exactly, for example, if you got 4, you'll know that that was referring to other. Variables at the ordinal level of measurement are defined by the attributes or characteristics that can be categorized as exhaustive and or mutually exclusive. So the numerical value assigned to the variables can be logically ranked, but the intervals between the categories may not be equal. So when it comes to ordinal, they can be ranked. However, the intervals between the categories may not be equal, and so they're ordinal level. For example, a satisfaction survey has responses from 0 not satisfied to 5 very satisfied. The responses are exhaustive and mutually exclusive. However, the difference between a 0 and a 1 and the difference between a 1 and a 2 rating may not be the same. So variables measured at the ordinal level can include income, social economic status, and degrees earned. Variables measured at the interval level also have to meet the criteria of being exhaustive and mutually exclusive. Numeric values assigned to the categories can be logically ranked, and the intervals between the categories are equal. So remember, with ordinal level, the categories or the intervals between the categories did not have to be equal. However, when it comes to interval level of measurement, the intervals between the categories must be equal. An example of a variable that is measured at the interval level is income. Variables at the racial level have the characteristics of variables at the interval level, but in addition, it has a true zero value. So the zero value has a real meaning when it's measured at the racial level. It does not mean the absence of a construct. For example, how often a respondent felt depressed in the last 2 weeks can be rated using a Likert scale where 0 means never, 1 is sometimes, 2 is always. And so if the participant selected a 0, the 0 has a true value of 0. So if they selected 0, it meant that they were never depressed. Income can be measured at the racial level because a respondent could report making $0 in the previous years. So although we mentioned earlier that income can be measured at the interval level, which has categories, so you can say someone makes 10,000 to 20,000, 30,000 to 40,000, and so forth, and that's an interval level, as long as the intervals between the categories are equal. When it comes to a racial level, we can also measure income at the racial level. The only difference is they would have a true zero value in this case. For example, the person, you would ask the question, what was your income? Or what is your income this year? And if a person selects 0, it meant that the person did not make any money during the course of that year. So measurement errors occur when the data collected do not accurately reflect the construct that we or the researcher are attempting to measure. Systematic error occurs when there's a pattern to that error. Systematic error may be introduced due to the wording of the items that lead the respondents toward or away from a particular response. Characteristics of the interviewer could result in participants not being candid about their responses. For example, women survivors of intimate partner violence might be more comfortable being interviewed by a woman than a man. Depending on the population, an interviewer who is casually dressed or dressed in business attire may result in more candid responses, and expressing an opinion could result in participants changing their responses to receive the interviewer's approval. Complete neutrality is needed except in the situations where neutrality is inappropriate. Errors may be caused when a participant provides the same response to all or most of the items on a measure. This is what we call a response set. An acquiescent response is a tendency to respond in a positive manner regardless of the questions asked. Social desirability bias occurs when the participants respond in a way that conveys a favorable impression on themselves or in a manner that they believe will be more consistent with the researcher's views. Recall bias occurs when one group of study participants is more likely to recall information requested than other groups of participants. For example, when conducting a study to learn whether taking a particular prescription medication during pregnancy resulted in birth defects, mothers of children that had birth defects may be more likely to recall taking that medication than mothers of healthy children because they are more motivated to recall information. It is possible that the medication did not cause the birth defect, but it could appear that it does if the mothers of children with the birth defects are more likely to remember taking the medication than mothers of healthy children. The Hawthorne effect may occur when study participants improve or change their behavior because they know that they're being studied. Random error occurs when there's no consistent pattern of measurement error. Random error does not result in bias towards accepting a hypothesis, but it weakens the ability to find a relationship between the variables specified in the hypothesis. It also diminishes the ability to reject the null hypothesis. This is known as bias towards the null. So random errors may occur when the participants do not understand the item on the survey. For example, they are tired or bored or distracted or they're rushing to complete the survey. An example of a question that may produce random error is one that is ambiguous. Do you think access to health care is a right of all U.S. citizens? Here, it is not clear if the question is referring to government funding health care or private health care. So, random error can also occur when researchers are conducting interviews, if the researcher is not sure how to interpret the participants' answers. Random error can also be due to difficulty recalling information requested. So sometimes if a participant is participating in a study of something that occurred a long time ago, they may not recall all of the information or they may not recall, and so that can also cause random error. Reliability and validity are two concepts that describe the quality of a measurement process or an instrument. Reliability is the degree to which a measurement is consistent or dependent, so it gives the same result over and over again. It is assessed by looking at the correlation between measures or items comprising that measure. Validity is the degree to which the measure actually measures what it says it's designed to measure. Inter-rater reliability is the degree of agreement between the raters. So measure of the degree of consistency among multiple observers. So if you have multiple people observing, multiple people rating during a study, inter-rater reliability is when there is a degree of agreement between all the different raters, all the different observers. Inter-observer reliability is the degree of agreement between the observers. Cohen's kappa indicates the level of inter-rater reliability between two raters. It ranges from 0, no agreement, to 1, which is the perfect agreement. Test-retest reliability assesses the stability or consistency of a measure over time. So if a measure is reliable, the participant should give the same responses each time the question is asked, assuming the question is about something that does not change over time. This type may not be appropriate for all measures, for example, in the case of assessing depression, where the levels do fluctuate. Split half reliability is used to determine the consistency of items on a scale. It compares scores on two half scales. The entire scale is administered to study participants, and then the items are randomly divided across two scales, each containing half the items of the original scale. The scores on the two halves are then compared statistically to determine the degree of similarity. If all the items on the scales are consistent with each other, then the two halves should yield very similar scores. Internal consistency is another indicator of the reliability of a scale. Internal consistency is achieved when the items on a scale are consistent with each other. Crumbach's alpha is used to assess the degree of internal consistency of the scale's items. It is assessed by calculating the degree of similarity each item has with each of the other items. This is done by correlating each item on the scale with each other. The average of all of these correlations is referred to as the Crumbach's alpha. A higher Crumbach alpha represents a stronger evidence that all the items on the scale are measuring the same construct. Crumbach alpha should be at least 0.70 and preferably 0.80 or higher. So whenever you're looking at other articles, you would want to see a Crumbach alpha of 0.80 or higher, but if it's at least 0.70, you can also use that. So validity is the degree to which the measure actually measures what it's designed to measure. Face validity is determined by making a subjective judgment about whether the items on a scale appears to be valid. It is the least rigorous form of the validity of a measure. Content validity is assessed by asking experts on the topic to evaluate whether items on the measure cover the full range of the concept. Criterion validity is based on how the measure compares to a criterion. A clinical diagnosis can be the criterion used to assess the validity of a depression scale. Concurrent validity indicates how well the measure responds with a criterion that is measured at the same time. So in the case of using a clinician's diagnosis as the criterion, one weakness is the presumption that the gold standard is itself valid, whereas clinicians often disagree about diagnosis. Known groups validity is a type of concurrent validity that assesses whether a measure can differentiate between groups known to differ on the variable being measured. Predictive validity assesses the ability of the measure to predict a criterion that occurs in the future. Evidence of predictive validity is found when a measure accurately predicts future performance. An example of predictive validity is to check whether high school SAT scores are indicative of future performance by comparing these scores with the same students' college GPA scores. Construct validity assesses how well the concepts of the variable was translated into a measure. This is the most stringent type of validity and the most difficult to demonstrate. There are two types of construct validity: convergent and divergent validity. A measure has convergent validity when it is correlated with measures which it should be related to based on theory or empirical evidence. A measure has divergent validity when it is not correlated with other measures to which it should not be related. So a measure being reliable does not mean that it is also valid. The use of more than one measure or method, or using multiple sources to measure a variable, can strengthen validity. Reliability and validity are specific to the population and particular circumstances under which the measure is being used. Researchers should choose the measure that have been validated in a sample as similar as possible to the target population in their study. Check that the measures are performing as expected in a new study. In social work, choosing measures that are reliable and valid is challenging. Many of the concepts are complex, ambiguous, and multidimensional. There is not always adequate evidence of reliability and validity of a measure, and researchers should choose the best possible measure for their study and remain aware of their limitations. Standardized measures have established reliability and validity. They should have a Crumbach alpha of 80 or higher. They should discriminate between high and low levels of construct of interest. Standardized measures may have cutoff scores, which are established scores used to determine if someone meets or does not measure a specific criterion. These can provide helpful information to determine the effectiveness of interventions. Using a standardized measure in another language. First, Check if there's an official translated version. Do not assume that the translation is correct. Revisions to the measure may be needed. There may be regional and national variations in the meaning of certain words. Translations must be appropriate for the population being studied. Literal translations may have different meanings in other language, so be very careful when using or when translating a survey or questionnaire. The goal of translating a measure into another language is to create a culturally equivalent version. Translations must capture both the denotative and connotative meaning. Denotative meaning is the literal translation of words. Connotative meaning captures the weight or intensity of words. Translations must be done by individuals who are bilingual as well as bicultural. Translating from the original language to the second language are prone to a lot of errors because it relies on an individual's knowledge, experience, and interpretation. Translation by a committee may be better because of more input, but may still not be appropriate if all the translators are similar to each other and different from the population studied. In back translation, one person translates from the original language in the second language, and another person then translates back into the original language. In case of discrepancies, seeking a consensus translation between the two translators or getting a third opinion is helpful. Decentering is a process in which the original items are translated. After comparing the original and translated items, the original items may be revised and another translation produced. This process continues until equivalent items are obtained in both languages. When translating standardized measures, decentering should not be used because wording of items in original language should not be changed, and the use of back translation and consensus achieves the best translation. Samples of standardized measures can be obtained by looking up the measure when doing a literature review or by reviewing two books. Measures for Clinical Practice and Research, a source book, 5th edition, Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 describes the standardized measures that can be used with couples, families, and children, and Volume 2 describes standardized measures that can be used with adults. So it's always good to use standardized measurements, but there are different times when a social worker may want to develop a new measure. It may be because they want to use a measure that has fewer items, or they want a measure that takes less time to administer. It can be completed by respondent than through the interviewer. So those are just some different reasons that a social worker may decide to develop their own measure instead of using one that's already developed. With the self-administered measure questionnaire, respondents complete the questions themselves. And with the interview schedule, the interviewer reads questions to the respondents. So when you think about measurement, you need to determine the type of questions that will be asked. With open-ended questions, respondents are asked to provide their own answers. With closed-ended questions, respondents are asked to select an option provided by the researcher. The response options has a numeric value assigned, and the response categories should be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. You should also determine the wording of questions. So the wording of questions should be clear, concise, and ambiguous. Questions should be clear. Respondents should understand what is being asked. Questions should be unambiguous and specific. An example of an ambiguous question is, how many times did you visit the doctor? This question is ambiguous because there are different types of doctors. So it's difficult for the participants to determine which doctor are you talking about. The doctor I saw last, the doctor for the specific condition, which doctor are you talking about? So be very specific. Questions that are ambiguous may affect the person's ability to answer the question. Careful wording of questions reduces random error. Certain types of questions should also be avoided. Negatively worded questions are usually questions that contain the word no or not. Double-barreled questions are questions that contain more than one issue but allow for only one response. For example, How satisfied are you with your living conditions and your landlord's ability to address your concerns? Two questions in one. So, which one do I answer? My response may be different for each question, but you have two questions in one. It's difficult to answer that question, or the response won't be accurate. Loaded questions are questions that contain an assumption. For example, have you quit smoking? So, this is assuming that someone is still smoking. Biased questions are questions that encourage the respondents to respond in a particular way. For example, should the voting age be lowered to 16 as today's youth are more politically engaged compared to youth in the past? In this question, there is an assumption stated to make the participants say yes, as it was stated that today's youth are more politically engaged compared to youth in the past. So be careful with those types of questions. Researchers' choice of how the response option will be rated depends on the type of question being asked. Dichotomous rating for yes, no, or true, false responses. Likert scale format for questions about attitudes, feelings, or opinions. The Likert scale is the sum of responses to the Likert items or the items on the survey. Likert items are normally formatted as strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree or disagree, agree, or strongly agree. Researchers may use the 3-point, 5-point, or 7-point response options, but usually the 5-point response option is the most common. NASW code states that social workers are ethically responsible to their clients. The first CSWE competency states that social workers demonstrate ethical and professional behavior. Neither the NASW code nor the CSWE explicitly mentions the role of ethics and measurement. So APA's ethical standard related to assessment, ethical principles of psychologists, and conduct of code has 11 areas of assessment. This standard covers 11 areas: the basis of assessment, use of assessment, informed consent in assessment, release of test data, test construction, interpreting assessment results, assessment by unqualified professions, obsolete tests and outdated test results, test scoring and interpretation services, explaining assessment results, and maintaining security. Ethical responsibilities that social workers have. They should use measures that are reliable and valid for the population they serve. They should obtain informed consent prior to conducting any assessment, and they should use the most up-to-date version of assessment tool. Using obsolete or outdated measures could result in potential harm to clients. So competency 4, engage in practice-informed research and research-informed practice, states that social workers know the principles of culturally informed approaches to building knowledge. Competency 2, engage diversity and difference in practice, states that measurement issues must be considered when working with diverse groups. Culturally incompetent researchers use measurements that have been shown to be reliable and valid for the population they are studying. Measurement equivalence is establishing equivalence by examining how items function across the groups. Linguistic equivalence is the extent to which a measure is compatible with the language and culture to which it will be adopted. Conceptual equivalence is the extent to which concepts represented by items making up the measure are understood to have the same meaning across cultural groups. This assumes that equivalent terms have been used. Metric equivalence is equivalence in item or question difficulty across groups. For example, when individuals from different communities with the same perception of support select the same response category. So when working with diverse groups, it is important that you use culturally appropriate measures. When using a measure outside the original cultural group, researchers should look for studies of measurement equivalence. Without measurement equivalence, the interpretation of the measures may not be reliable or valid for the new group, leading to inaccurate conclusions of the study findings. So whenever you are working with diverse groups, it's really important that you try to find a survey that is equivalent to the population that you're studying. If you don't do that, then the results may be inaccurate. When research findings are biased due to measures that are not valid or reliable for a particular group, the group could be adversely affected. So using a measure that is not valid or reliable for a particular group can cause harm to your participants. The need for measurement equivalence applies across cultural groups and for gender, sexual orientation, age, and other characteristics. Prior to conducting the study, researchers should seek consultation about how to measure the concepts and what measure to use. So it's really important as researchers that you pay attention to diversity, pay attention to the population that you're studying, and make sure that you are using measures that are reliable and valid. And that brings us to the end of chapter 5.